Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Kwita Izina Conversation on Conservation Conference, part of the 16th annual Kwita Izina celebrations and the first ever virtual conversation on conservation. I am Joan Mazamhaka, your host for today's event. We're grateful to have you join us, and I'm very excited to have you participate in and engage with all of our sessions today. This year, the Kwita Izina Gorilla Naming Ceremony celebrated conservation and the people who protect the majestic mountain gorillas. Today, we're joined by experts and innovators who are eager to engage in in-depth discussions that concern the future of tourism and conservation. We'll be hosting 4 panels today with Q&A sessions at the end of each. We encourage you to participate by submitting your questions directly to the chat, and then selected questions will be asked to panelists. I know you're all as eager to get started as I am, and I would now like to welcome RDB's Chief Tourism Officer, Belize Kariza, who will also introduce our keynote speaker, Fred Swaniker, founder and CEO of the African Leadership Group. Belize, thank you.
Distinguished guests, conservation champions, friends from Rwanda, friends from around the world, greetings from Rwanda. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on conservation as part of the 16th Kwita Izina Gorilla Naming Ceremony. I would like to extend a warm welcome to the many special guests who have joined this discussion from all corners of the globe. Despite the challenging times we're living in, we are fortunate to still be able to come together virtually to share ideas, experiences, and expand the constituency for conservation. Today's conversation will examine the conservation opportunities and challenges we're facing and encourage dialogue and engagement amongst you, key conservation stakeholders. We also hope to support collaborative efforts and highlight the impact of conservation and ecotourism on community development. We will also gain an insight into how technology is driving forward wildlife protection and how entrepreneurship, innovation, and new ways of thinking can supercharge conservation and development. We are honored to be joined by experts in the field who have dedicated their lives to protecting wildlife and their natural habitats. I wish to thank our guest speakers, moderators, and panelists for sharing your time and insight with all of us. There is no doubt that this pandemic has significantly impacted conservation and tourism. In many ways, it has exposed a weakness that perhaps we had tried to avoid. That is, what happens if tourists stop coming? How do we then fund research and conservation? How do we continue community development? How do we create well-paying jobs and foster new industries? These are difficult questions, but one we ask if we're able to become more resilient once the threat from the pandemic subsides. That's why the first topic on how we can best finance nature conservation is so critical. We have the passion, the knowledge, and the skills, but we also need the resources to invest in conservation and reap the rewards. We also know that the challenge is not just monetary. It's more fundamental than that. Today, humanity's relationship with nature is widely unsustainable, and we're losing valuable biodiversity every single day. But it's not only our natural environment that is paying the price. The pandemic is the direct result of this unsustainable relationship, and its toll on humanity has been tragic and severe. As guardians of mountain gorillas, some of our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, Rwanda knows all too well the threat the virus poses to these majestic animals. That's why we've introduced a range of robust measures to ensure the well-being of the community, our park staff, visitors, and finally, our wildlife, and especially the mountain gorillas. I look forward to hearing more from our team of vets later in the discussion. Addressing these kinds of complex challenges requires collaboration. That is why I'm so excited to learn from our eminent speakers today and to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Fred Swaniker. Fred is the founder and CEO of the African Leadership Group, and a dear friend to Rwanda. We're proud of the contribution that the African Leadership University here in Kigali is making to conservation across the continent. And we are very grateful that you've taken this time to be with us today. Thank you. With these few words, let me once again thank you all for joining today's Kwita Izina conversation on conservation, and welcome Fred to give your keynote address. Thank you very much. Merci. Murakoze. Asante sana.
Thank you, Belize, for your kind introduction. And let me also thank the Rwanda Development Board and its leadership team for inviting me to share these opening remarks. I'd also like to extend my warm greetings to all of you who are joining us online for this conversation on conservation. There are many things that are remarkable about Rwanda. Kwita Izina and the country's overall focus on conservation, in my opinion, is one of them. See, I really believe that countries that are successful are those that don't follow conventional wisdom. Instead, they play to their unique strengths. And gorillas, mountain gorillas, in some ways unique to Rwanda. They're one of Rwanda's best ambassadors. And this naming ceremony itself and the entire national week that gets together to honor gorillas is really unique. And by focusing on its unique assets, Rwanda is benefiting. As you may know, tourism, primarily driven by wildlife tourism like gorillas, makes up about 14 to 16% of Rwanda's GDP. And it's one of the country's highest earners of foreign exchange. What's also remarkable about Rwanda is how 10% of income that comes from conservation, from tourism, goes directly to the communities that live around protected areas. And so there's a vested interest that everyone has in conservation. So this is not just a nice to have, it's vital for Rwanda's people. What I also quite find remarkable are the indirect effects that conservation has in Rwanda. It has a true ripple effect for the country's image. And indirectly, it's also attracting people to come and do many other great, wonderful things in Rwanda. So some people come to Rwanda for the first time, perhaps to see gorillas, but then they return for other things. They stay and they invest in industry and they get involved in the communities and they contribute in other ways. So there are direct benefits that Rwanda is getting from its conservation tourism, but there are also so many wonderful indirect benefits, which we often overlook. I believe that so many other countries in Africa are endowed with wildlife, and they're missing a huge opportunity for economic development by underinvesting in conservation. And so for those who are listening from across the continent, I hope we'll learn from the Rwanda's example as we think about how we can elevate this to a continental level, to really think about how wildlife can be one of the greatest assets to contribute to Africa's development. As I close, I want to challenge the other speakers on this in this conversation that we're going to be having in the next couple of hours. As Belize mentioned, we are meeting at a moment of crisis for conservation. For the last few decades, most of conservation has been funded by tourism. In fact, at the African Leadership University, we recently launched a research project on the wildlife economy to really try and understand the contributions that wildlife makes to Africa's economy and the different sources. And we're finding the data showing that between 20 to 80% of conservation revenues are coming from tourism, depending on the country and the situation. And therefore, when we are looking at the crisis that has been brought on the world by the pandemic, now is not the time for tradition. We need innovation. We need unconventional thinking. Because one of the things I really believe is that constraints drives innovation. And right now we have a lot of constraints. So I challenge us to think differently and to reimagine how we can sustain conservation. Should we be setting up a subscription channel for people to watch gorillas, virtual reality, so that people can be in the midst of gorillas but without being there? I mean, these are the kinds of ideas that we should be thinking about in this moment. Let's think bold, and let's think unconventional. Because, you know, Africa, when it has so many challenges to address, and we're not going to address them by thinking conventionally. And so that's my challenge to you today, is to really think about how we not only deal with a crisis, but actually use this crisis to reimagine how we think about conservation, and to actually emerge from this pandemic stronger than we were before it. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conversation.
Hello, thank you so much to both Ms. Kadiza and Mr. Svanica. I think it is quite fitting that Mr. Svanica has challenged us now to have conversations around innovating and around how we can change the way things currently are in order to do better for the future. In that vein, our first panel session is on restructuring economic and financing systems to sustain nature conservation, ecotourism, and community livelihood development amidst a global pandemic. Our economies, livelihoods, and well-being all rely on nature to provide us with food, water, and shelter, to regulate our climate and control disease, to maintain nutrient cycles and oxygen production, and much, much more. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to the closure of many protected and conserved areas, including community conservancies and development projects in many countries. So now what? I would like to introduce Peter Katanisa, World Bank consultant, and our moderator for this panel. Peter.
Thank you, Joanne, for introducing this session. Dear leaders on this forum and our wonderful participants in today's conversation on conservation, we welcome you all and thank you for tuning in to have a conservation conversation for this year's Kwita Izina under the broader theme of conservation and sustainable tourism, a foundation for future generations. The theme brings out clearly the key issues we are facing as of today now. So bearing in mind the limited time we have, allow me to quickly introduce to you our wonderful speakers for this session, as Joanne has introduced it. The first speaker will be Mr. Chris Roche, a well-known and respected ecotourism and conservation consultant with nearly 25 years experience with landmark African ecotourism companies, such as Wilderness Safaris and Beyond, including at executive level in areas such as sustainability, marketing, and business development. Chris is a passionate advocate for the good that ecotourism conducted properly can achieve for biodiversity conservation. Chris has worked on ecotourism and conservation projects in 18 African countries and provided ecotourism advisory services in South America, the United Kingdom, Europe, and the Far East. It's great to have you here, Chris. You're most welcome. The second speaker will be Miss Catherine Fitzgerald. Catherine is a senior conservation advisor to the African Wildlife Foundation and leads Conservation Capital's Business Consulting African Division. She has more than 25 years of experience in integrated landscape conservation programs in Africa and North America, and served as a vice president to the Africa Wildlife Foundation for 6 years. Catherine has helped create new conservation areas, improve management of existing protected areas, established co-management arrangement, and designed innovative models for community conservation. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us today. And our third speaker is Mr. Eugene Rutagarama. Mr. Rutagarama is a Rwandan senior conservationist and a businessman. Rutagarama has over 25 years of experience working in conservation in the Congo Basin, Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC, especially with particular expertise in wildlife, park management, capacity building, program coordination, contingency planning, emergency programming, and institutional and team building. Rutagarama is a committed and respected conservation professional whose work in support of the mountain gorillas has been nationally and internationally recognized. Please let us welcome Rutagarama. Now let us proceed with our discussions of today for this specific session. Our first topic of today, which is the one we are working on right now or going to discuss with the theme topic, restructuring economic and financial systems to sustain natural conservation, ecotourism, and community livelihood development amidst a global pandemic is timely as we are right now in the middle of global pandemic of COVID-19. Each and every one of us is being impacted in one way or the other. Our economies, livelihoods, and well-being all rely on nature and gives us much effort and strength for us to focus and prioritize conservation. Any dysfunctional relationship between humans and nature, like climate change, loss of biodiversity, fragmentation of habitat, domestication of wild and illegal trade of wildlife, can result in a serious implications for us as evident from the pandemic of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to the closure of many protected and conserved areas, including community conservancies and development projects in many countries. This has resulted in dramatic declines in nature-based and wildlife tourism, which is an important source of revenue for governments and local people in many countries, including our own Rwanda. So without much ado, allow me now to go through the discussion and introduce the first speaker, Mr. Chris Roche. Chris, the first question, I think maybe you can discuss and share your ideas is, Chris, you work in the high-end conservation tourism. Clearly, this has been badly impacted by the COVID-19. And not only has profitability of the private sector been removed, but pressure on the ability of the state or other landowners to cover the costs of conservation is also severe. This has huge ramifications for the gains made in biodiversity conservation over the last decade in particular. What's your view on the potential short-term solutions to address this?
Thanks, Peter, for a challenging question. Yeah, I think in essence, as the CTO and the keynote speaker pointed out, the disruption of international travel has really exposed the fundamental flaw in high-end ecotourism. People need to be able to travel to get to places in order to spend money, in order to drive this conservation economy or wildlife economy. And without the ability to travel, obviously all of that's undone. So I think, start talking about short-term solutions. The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is the diversification, not only within tourism, but also beyond tourism. So, and as the keynote pointed out, the last decade or more, 15, 20 years, has seen ecotourism be the primary funder of conservation activities, apart from aid. So there's primary sustainable funder. And that's all been undone. So how do we diversify away from that? I think obviously the domestic tourism market is critical, and not just in the short term, but also for the longer term. And I think like a local tourism domestic campaign like RDB is running in Rwanda, Tembera, Rwanda, has been successful in that regard. I think Akagera is a great example of where the bulk of the visitors are in fact from within the country, not from outside. And that's an important funder of its operations. But apart from just diversifying access and the markets you target, you also need to diversify the product and therefore the attractiveness of your product to those different markets. And then one other thing that Fred mentioned, and I think it's definitely worth touching on here, is the adoption of some sort of aspect of the digital economy. So in the same way that Zoom has replaced travel, I'm sure that we can be innovative enough to find a way where this kind of virtual tourism can not replace, but can supplement in-person, in-situ guerrilla tourism. So, and maybe we can discuss details around that, but what's neat and useful about it is that you have almost an unlimited capacity without having any additional impact on the ecosystem or the animals themselves. So currently, I think it's capped at 96 visitors per day. And so that obviously caps the amount of revenue you can generate per day. If you remove that cap and obviously adjust the price accordingly, you can up the volume and find a different revenue stream. I think also, especially in the short term, and there's been some success in this approach in Kenya that I can think of and elsewhere, where the ability to appeal to the charity of the rest of the world is worth pursuing. So community conservancies in Kenya, for example, people who've traveled to them and who follow them on social media and are still interested in the goings on there, are being encouraged to adopt an acre. So, for example, those conservancies manage their rent to the community based on the size, and without tourism being able to generate revenue to pay for that, can you generate similar kinds of payments, voluntary payments, from people who've appreciated that experience in the past? Yeah, I think if there was an easy answer to this question, we wouldn't be having the panel. And I hope that there are people in the audience and the fellow panelists who have some other ideas. You're on mute, Peter.
Thank you, Chris, for that discussion and those highlights. So those might solve some conservation costs held by protected area agencies and the like, but there is also a far more widespread impact on rural livelihoods, and thus increased pressure on natural resources, both surrounding and within the protected areas. How can we address those challenges?
Yeah, that's a good point. Generating revenue is one thing, but when you can't generate revenue, when you can't generate sufficient revenue in order to meet subsistence needs, then pressures obviously on resources within and immediately adjacent to national parks take a lot of pressure. And I think that again is an area where innovation is possible. And again, as Fred mentioned, in the wildlife economy across Africa, there's a huge variety of activities that generate either protein or non-timber forest products and the like without damaging the ecosystem and in a sustainable fashion. And the question now, I think, is if, say, for example, coronavirus continued to impact tourism for another 18 months, God forbid, how would you address the needs of especially poor rural communities living adjacent to protected areas? And I think this is in the pipeline in Rwanda at the moment, sort of to amend or adopt a legislation to allow for game ranching. In the past, there's been a fishery in Lake Ihema in Akagera. And I think both of those kind of activities kind of get to the heart of the matter. If you can't generate revenue, you should generate sustenance. And what's the word I'm looking for? You need to address basic needs somewhere in that hierarchy of needs. So whether it's food rather than employment. And of course, in Rwanda, everything, the ecosystem services are very visible. If you take a case like Kishwati, where deforestation 30, 40 years ago led to erosion and excuse the pun, an erosion of ecosystem services, reforestation has restored those. And I think that, that sort of thing should be explored in a further way, so people are able to appreciate the value of protected areas, both for the free services that they give, free, but also to innovate in a way that you can generate more impactful kind of benefits for the surrounding communities as a result of those raw natural resources.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for those opportunities you have shared with us. Let's come to our next speaker, Catherine. following up on what Chris has been pointing out, Chris spoke about some of the short-term solutions to help mitigate the impacts of COVID on protected areas. What are some of the longer-term solutions to ensuring the integrity of protected areas and benefits to communities?
Great,
Catherine?
thanks, Peter. Yes, great question. And first off, thanks for everyone who's joined. Obviously, this is a really topical issue. How do we create sustainable finance to support Africa's protected area state? And the context was set really nicely by Belize and Fred, so thank you for that. I think it's also appropriate we're having this conversation in Rwanda, right? Because Rwanda has been a leader in innovation, and Rwanda has demonstrated that development and conservation can go hand in hand. And so thank you for hosting this. Chris used the word diversify, and I think that's going to be the word of the day. We need to diversify because what COVID has demonstrated is the fragility of our entire conservation finance structure. It's reliant on the international tourism market and tourism funding, right? So we all know that that's not sustainable. And that's the bad news, right? But the good news, in my opinion, is that Africa has wonderful case studies and examples of how to diversify. So we don't even need to look beyond the continent. So for starters, natural capital accounting, which Rwanda is already doing. How do we value the ecosystem services that are quote unquote free? And how do we incorporate those into our national budgets? Rwanda is already doing that. We need to do that across the continent. Number two is green growth strategies. Again, Rwanda already has a green growth climate resilience strategy. So each of the countries need to plan for green growth, development that's compatible with conservation. Looking at the protected areas in terms of other means for generating revenue, Chris mentioned diversifying within the tourism industry, 100%. I also think now is an opportunity to look at how to get tourism to work more for conservation. There are certainly companies that are supporting conservation of wildlife and wildlands. There are some other companies that need to do more. And now is an opportunity to look at how to optimize the economic opportunities within the tourism industry. Going beyond the tourism industry though, carbon credits, number one. You know, Kenya supported the first validated and verified carbon project in the world. And so this can be replicated throughout Africa. Number two, payment for ecosystem services. South Africa, for example, has seen some great payment for ecosystem services around water. These are all mechanisms that have been developed and are successful within Africa, and they can be replicated. Payment for performance mechanisms. So many of you may have heard about the Rhino Impact Bond, tying investment to a conservation outcome. What about a mountain gorilla bond? I think that will help attract funding to Rwanda and DRC and Uganda around mountain gorillas. We'll hear later from Jess, I think, from African Parks. Another tool that's being used throughout the continent are collaborative management agreements. And that is another way of enhancing conservation effectiveness and attracting funding. So Peter, I can go on and on about amazing examples that are already taking place across Africa. I think the challenge now is how do we replicate those and how do we scale those to work for conservation?
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much. So as a follow-up question on that, on what you have put forward as opportunities and what advice would you provide to protected area authorities in Africa to help them navigate the current crisis?
So the first thing I would advise is figure out what you need. And that sounds kind of flip, but if you look at the protected area state in Africa, most of our protected areas don't have business plans. And so it's very difficult, in particular now when there's a crisis. We already know there's a shortage of funding for conservation. And so the onus is on the protected area authorities to really figure out, what do you need to sustain and manage your protected areas? And so I would say the first thing protected area authorities need to do is figure out what you need to manage your protected area individually, but also the estate as a whole. And I think that's where donors can provide substantial support, because in some countries, there's not that expertise in-house. And so if donors can support proper business planning for protected areas and protected area estates, I think that that would be a tremendous step, because then you can target different innovative finance models. You can target donor funding more strategically and more efficiently.
Thank you so much, Catherine. You touched upon key opportunities that businesses can do. So I think it's very important now that we bring in Mr. Eugene Utagarama, a business person. So Mr. Eugene, can you hear us? Hello, Mr. Eugene? Mr. Eugene is not, is facing some technical issues. I think let's continue the discussion. Chris and Catherine, there is already in the question and answer. I think this could go to Chris, some question. Eri is asking, COVID has strongly affected the livelihood of communities. Special attention to rural communities around the protected areas with potential illegal harvesting of natural resources from parks. Is there any particular attention paid to that conservation component during this global crisis? Chris, can you take on that question?
Yeah, I think that's actually the major focus during this global crisis. All of the conservation organizations and private sector operators and governments that I'm involved with are all focused on this area. A lot of it is, in the form of aid, as in using philanthropy to generate what people would have generated themselves had that been employed. And yeah, so that's been a huge aspect of what's happening in the Okavango Delta, for example. And I think, again, to go back to that, the example of the Kenyan community conservancies from earlier, the same thing there. Tourism companies faced without the ability to pay for their leases because they're not generating revenue, are using philanthropy or charity to pay for those leases. And as a result of that, the communities are not being deprived of their income, or if they are, it's not totally wiped out. I see I've lost my co-panelists. One's back, Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to add to that? I'm sure you've got ideas that I didn't raise. You're on mute as well. Just the idea of how to address community shortages.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you commented on is what we've seen across the continent. In particular, you use Mara as an example. I've been really impressed with what we've seen in terms of figuring out, again, what we need to maintain basic operations within conservation areas, and also figuring out what we need to maintain those concessions and leases, which is essentially a payment for ecosystem service, right? And Mara is a great example where every year, $7.5 million is paid to 14,000 landowners to keep the area open for wildlife. And so what we've seen in that example specifically is the landowners have agreed to a 50% reduction in those fees. And then we've seen incredible support from the donor community coming in to meet that gap. So I think that is a great positive example.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. There's another question. I think if you allow me, now we should go into, we open the forum for all participants. Dear participants, if you have a question to the speakers, please, the floor is yours, as we also continue to answer some of the questions that have been posed in Q&A chat.
There's one there, Peter, that we can address. Perhaps how can we sustain wildlife conservation and keep related tourism during / after COVID-19, focused on the same ambitions as we had before? Kathleen?
Yeah, and I'm looking at another question as well in terms of, I was looking at the community impact. You know, Fred mentioned 10% of the benefit share in Rwanda, right? What an amazing revenue share. I think it's one of the highest in Africa. One of the things that we need to think through going forward in terms of community benefits and related to that last question is a reserve fund. To my knowledge, most of our protected areas and programs, there are no reserve funds. And so as we think about restructuring and building a stronger, more resilient structure going forward, I think any planning needs to incorporate a reserve fund. And then also looking at that revenue share, how can that revenue share drive additional business that's non-tourism related? And Rwanda is already doing this by funding different agriculture projects, funding different bamboo projects. So using that tourism revenue to drive different businesses in a sustainable way, I think is a way to make the communities more resilient to future shocks.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we've had to come to the end of this panel. Thank you so much for the engaging conversation. And thank you, Peter, as well for moderating the panel. It's actually great to see that the possibilities are endless, but also that it's not just for the future, but things are already happening now that will really try to preserve this for the future. So thank you all so much for your participation in the panel. And thank you for the questions that we got from the chat as well. We really appreciate it. So as we consider this year's Kwita Izina theme of a foundation for future generations, we have brought 4 experts to give specific talks on scaling innovation and technologies in conservation. You'll hear from Jess Gruner, CEO of Akagera Management Company, Yves Iradukunda, PS from the Ministry of ICT and Innovation, Mami Ingabire, Managing Director of CARES UAS, and Tessie Rusagara, the MD of Kigali Innovation City. Please place any questions that you have for the session in the chat, in the Q&A session, and we will ask the questions after. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Yves Iradukunda. I'm the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of ICT and Innovation in the Government of Rwanda. It is my pleasure to join today the Kwita Izina 16th edition and to reflect with you on the use of technology in conservation efforts. Rwanda started a journey of digitization and putting ICT at the center of socio-economic development about 20 years ago. We started by creating an enabling environment, and this was followed by investing in infrastructure development to create this ICT ecosystem. In particular, laying the fiber connectivity across the country unlocked many opportunities. We've now seen internet penetration increasing as well as smart device penetration. Particularly in conservation, this enabled the Rwanda Development Board to implement various technological solutions, such as the use of drone technologies, cyber trackers for data collection, detection dogs, GIS and remote sensing, And we are also seeing the use of virtual reality technologies to increase accessibility and provide for educational programs that promote awareness on the wildlife. The same infrastructure is also enabling us to build institutional capacity and increase talent in technology that will allow us to innovate and collaborate for the solutions that we need. For instance, we're investing in the Kigali Innovation City, not only to nurture these innovations, but also to scale them in Rwanda and across the continent and globally. And recently, we established the Center for Artificial Intelligence, Innovation and Policy. This will be creating the right policies and the right environment for various innovators to tap into emerging technologies. We also recently established the Rwanda Space Agency. This, in my mind, is a breakthrough for conservation efforts. Globally, technological advances such as deep learning and access to high-resolution imagery has provided ecologists and conservationists with the right tools to accurately count the wildlife population, to provide rapid detection of deforestation, illegal mining, and other changes in the landscape. We're very much looking forward to the contribution that the Rwanda Space Agency will bring towards conservation efforts. However, as we discuss today and reflect on the role of technology, technology and policies alone are not enough. We must bring creativity and innovation to plan and design systems that can truly achieve conservation at scale. We cannot talk about sustainable tourism without thinking about our day-to-day activities. And, maybe to put this into perspective, and using Africa as an example, by 2035, Africa's population will be 1.8 billion. And by 2050, we will have a population of 2.5 billion. What does that mean for us? It means that we need to think of an African city that is able to provide sustainably for smart transportation, waste management system, and efficient use of energy. Today, allow me to share with you some of the initiatives that we are working on as the government of Rwanda to ensure that these smart solutions can enable us to achieve sustainability at scale. The first initiative is implementing the smart waste management system, which will primarily focus on the intelligent monitoring and analytics. And this will be coupled with a smart command and control center that provides a dashboard that enables us to see real-time different data points on city functions. The data collected will ultimately enable us to empower the municipal decision-making that leverage the data, as well as the urban planning and resource management. The second initiative I want to share with you today is the air quality pollution monitoring system. This is in partnership with the city of Kigali and Tactis, where different points on air pollutant will be detected and identified, and the data will be collected to design interventions that combat climate change, as well as design for safer environment for the citizens. Everyone has a role to play, both the government, the civil society, and various innovators within the private sector. I wish to call for more collaboration from everyone as we advance our efforts in conservation. I thank you very much.
I'm pleased to be here, and I'm delighted to share with you this amazing technology. Actually, this technology is the future. In our world today, there is scarcity of resources. Everything must be done faster. We are looking for quick solutions for our challenges. And I'm really delighted to share with you drone-based monitoring solution or technology in nature conservation. My name is Mami Ingabire Muziga. I'm the Managing Director of CARIS UIS. Caris UIS is a fast-growing company and licensed drone operator based in Rwanda, and we are actually working now in 5 African countries. And today, I'm going to share with you how drone-based monitoring in nature conservation, it is the solution to tackle all the challenges that we find in nature conservation. One of the key things that I want you to know about this technology, that it offers flexible and accurate and affordable solutions to challenges of nature conservation. With rapid data acquisition using different type of sensors and with limited sources, this technology leads to targeted interventions. And with that, you can use this technology for you to be able to monitor and to ensure that your forests are well conserved, that all the restoration activities are well monitored. And as well, you can use this technology in aerial inventory. That means in tree counting, and that you use AI for that type of solutions. And with drone-based monitoring, we cover large areas in a short time. I just want to share with you some of the success stories that we have had. We have done drone-based monitoring of all the wetlands in Kigali and the outskirts of Kigali. And that was done in a very short time. We were able to cover over 13,000 hectares in a space of 2 months using drones. And with this drone-based technology and monitoring, we were able to provide all the information that they need in a very short time. And that was really successful. With that, we provided imagery that showed how the wetlands are managed. The other success stories that we had with REMA is in RAFREC, which is a project in landscape approach, forest restoration, and conservation. And it's all about monitoring all the restoration activities taking place in riverbank, in mining site, terracing restorations, in Nyabihu, Rutsiro, and Ngororero districts. With limited resource, we are able to monitor those sites in a very short time. And with that, it helps the agency to plan targeted interventions to ensure that all that needs to be done in conservation is well done with limited resources and on time. This is very an exciting technology that we are providing, and we have an amazing team that we are working with to ensure that this is properly done, and we are scaling up our solution. I'm delighted to present to you our executive team. As you can see, it's a young-led company in Rwanda. Thank you so very much.
Good day, my name is Jess Gruner. I'm the Park Manager of Akagera National Park, and today I'm going to be talking to you about scaling innovations and technology in conservation, specifically talking to Akagera National Park. Akagera National Park is a PPP, public-private partnership between Rwanda Development Board, the conservation arm of the Rwandan government, and African Parks Network. It's been a partnership for the last 10 years and doing very, very well. Akagera National Park has a multitude of beautiful biomes and landscapes. It has the wetlands, the rolling hills, the savanna plains, riverine forest. Yet to do technology in this environment is hard. We have tried to implement new methods to try and improve the management. And that comes down to having a central command and control office, where all our future technologies or present technologies come into and inform us as management. Some of the tools we're using are Cyber Tracker. This is an Android app held by our rangers in the field, icon-based, and they touch when they see certain things and they insert the number and it feeds back live to our command and control. Also, to allow this, we have a Smart Parks system, or LoRa. This is sending small bits of information from transmitters to our towers back to our command and control. And this can be monitored through our staff in the field, sensors on our animals, and sensors on our vehicles, fence sensors, etc. And that goes back to the command and control. Further to that, we have a dashboard. This dashboard comes through ArcGIS Solutions for Protected Area Management, ESRI, and it creates a dashboard that we can manage the park. We can really get an understanding of lion information, fire, extent of fires, rhino sightings, elephant sightings, movements of elephants, and community collaboration, human-wildlife conflict. All of this is on that dashboard. And as we've been talking of conservation and all of these different type of platforms, it's paramount to have one that pulls it all together. And that is through Earth Ranger, developed through Vulcan. Earth Ranger allows us to get a situational awareness of what is happening. You can see on the picture on the left there, we've got some lions, some radios, even a vehicle. That is what is happening at a specific time. Further information that comes into that is telemetry. We also use technology on our animals. Rhinos, elephants, lions are key species and they need to be monitored. So we actually have to put transmitters on them and to know their whereabouts to ensure their security. And that is done through our team, as you can see on the image on the right, who are monitoring them daily and plotting their movements so we can strategize our movement. Technology is great, but without human resource and basic capital in that, we could have the best technology in the world. But if we don't manage it properly through our staff, it is pointless. So hand in hand, technology and capacity with staff is paramount. We look forward to the future of conservation with technology to move and roll out further initiatives such as other sensors, GPS, drones potentially. The future of conservation is exciting, especially linked to technology. Thank you very much.
My name is Tessie Rusagara, and I'm the Managing Director of Kigali Innovation City. Kigali Innovation City is a flagship Government of Rwanda program to build a technology park here in Rwanda to accelerate the tech and innovation ecosystem and position Rwanda as a Pan-African innovation hub. KIC is anchored by 4 universities that are developing world-class Pan-African talent here in Rwanda. These 4 universities are Carnegie Mellon University, Africa, the African Leadership University, the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, and the University of Rwanda School of Biomedical Engineering. And we're looking for more universities to contribute to this talent pool. Today, I would like to build off the stories of our previous speakers on tech innovation and adoption in conservation, and touch on what it means to scale innovation here in Rwanda and on the continent. And lastly, welcome all of you to use Rwanda as a testbed for innovation. There are many forces at play in the African continent today. Climate change, economic growth, population growth, urbanization, and rapid advances of technology. These forces simultaneously create threats to our biodiversity, but also unlock more opportunities for our natural resources as a driver of economic growth. The journey to unlock these opportunities is complex and multidisciplinary. And unfortunately, there's no one path to being innovative in order to address this. We all wish it was that easy. However, there are several toolkits, and I would like to touch on 3 of them today. The first tool is mindset shift, to break through the organizational and industry silos that we all work in and connect with different actors, specifically our universities, the private sector, our entrepreneurs, funders, government, and most importantly, our communities. One of my favorite conservation stories here in Rwanda is how the country was able to transform poachers in the national parks to rangers. From threats, they became stewards of our environment. This didn't require a tech solution, it didn't require a tech tool, but a mindset shift that required us to connect with people who are outside our normal realm of operating. The second tool I'll touch on is the need to foster collaboration across these different actors that we're talking about. The African Leadership University, one of KIC's anchor universities, has both a dedicated undergrad program and an MBA in conservation to groom the next generation of African leaders in the field. One major feature of this program, of ALU in general, is the collaboration with industry partners that's built into the design and the delivery of the program. This needs to become the norm across the world and should also be scaled if we want to see mainstreaming of conservation and other global issues into our education systems and into our private sector. The last tool that I'll touch on is entrepreneurship. We need to provide a platform to catalyze and scale innovation. And there's no greater engine for that than entrepreneurship. In the last decade, we've seen an increase in the support infrastructure for startups. There are more hubs, more accelerators, more venture capital funding, and other support infrastructure that is required to really transform entrepreneurship on the continent. We need to see more of this support and more specialized support, specifically in critical areas like conservation. And so now more than ever, we need to do more to support entrepreneurship in conservation. There's also room for entrepreneurship within our own organizations. Entrepreneurship is not just for startups. Governments, nonprofits, and our traditional private sector can also be entrepreneurial in the way they operate and solve problems. But to achieve that, we need to have the right mindset, we need to be intentional, and we need to collaborate across different actors if we want to see lasting and scalable impact. Our vision at Kigali Innovation City is to bring universities, tech companies, startups, and other actors in one physical place, because proximity leads to familiarity, which leads to collaboration, which in turn creates opportunities for co-creation and innovation. So I encourage you all to join us on this journey. Come and innovate in Rwanda. We're eager to partner with you. Thank you.
I would like to invite the panelists here just to answer a couple of questions that were asked in the chat for the Q&A session. If Eve, Tessie, Jess, and Mami are available. Thank you all for those sessions. Honestly, it was incredibly enlightening to see what the future holds and to see your enthusiasm and engagement for what is to come. The first question came from the YouTube Live and was asking, Eve, this is for you. Is space tourism part of Rwanda's future plans, which you did already mention? But I think they want to know maybe specifically what is planned for space tourism, if you can do it a little briefly.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I'm really delighted to be joining this conversation and looking at it from the technology perspective. There is a lot of opportunities. I think it was highlighted by speakers earlier, particularly Mr. Fred Swanika, on the immense opportunity for conservation. And I think technology equips us with the tools that allow us to do a lot more at scale, particularly when it comes to the space tourism. I think this is a new area for us, and the Space Agency was just recently put in place in Rwanda. So it's early stage of building capabilities and training and putting in place the right tools to be able to respond not only to tourism, but also to other applications in conservation and agriculture, urbanization, understanding the population, etc. So we know that with high resolution imagery that is increasingly accessible, we are seeing a lot of applications that can leverage those tools. And so we know that Rwanda will be also at the forefront in coming up with the right application, leveraging this infrastructure that we'll be putting in place to have more images. So I think a lot more work to be done. We call for innovators to join the journey, leveraging the the applications that will be developed through this Rwanda Space Agency that will be in place in support to conservation efforts.
Thank you so much, Eve. We do have one other question from one of the participants, and I think it applies across the board for you, Jess, Mami, and Tessie. Different actors, the question says, different actors, public, private, civil society, in biodiversity conservation and tourism have been collecting huge data sets with various spatial and temporal resolutions using different technologies. How far are we with their integration or sharing or one-point public access? What is the available infrastructure or hub, and who coordinates and finances this? So essentially, with all the information that each of you have mentioned that's being gathered, at what point is it available to the public, and who will be financing that process? I'm going to start with you, Jess.
Yeah, good afternoon. For us, most of the technology is to answer management questions and to serve for the management, the whereabouts of vehicles, the whereabouts of some of our key species. Unfortunately, some of this is sensitive information. We would definitely not share where our rhinos are or elephants or such. That is a tourism product where people as tourists come and they're lucky to see that, but we can definitely not share that with groups. Otherwise, there's a lot of data collected on fire management, on lakes and stuff like that. Some of that is being researched and answering management questions. So for an open database right now, it's very hard at the park scale to be providing an open source because it mainly serves management questions. So, but it will continue to do that until, till drone technology or land images come along, which can be shared. But again, we don't do it just for the sake of doing it. We do it to improve management and to answer our questions and to make Akagera a better place.
Thank you. And so, Mami, let me go to you as well with a similar question in terms of access to the information that your tools are gathering.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's actually the same thing for us. We provide those services to management. It's for decision making. So it's not; these are not data to share for the public. It's actually to provide information for the management to take right decision and then have targeted interventions. Thank you.
You're welcome. And so for you, Tessie, in terms of the Kigali Innovation City, and in terms of the information that it's an intellectual hub, essentially, of Rwanda, in terms of the information that you will be gathering there or the innovations that are coming from there, to what extent will it be available to the public? How will those innovations engage with the rest of the public?
Thanks, Joan. So what we'd ideally be doing is building off what the government has done. There's a data revolution policy that was in place with a goal to build an open data portal. And I think that process has begun with just collecting data that the government itself has and is able to collect from different institutions. So a very good next step is now to think about what's, first of all, within different sectors, and conservation being one of them, what's within the realm of the public sector, what else can be gathered from the private sector and different players. So understanding what's out there, sort of declassifying it, as Jess said, some of it is sensitive, but also what's the potential use of this data, potentially at least finding a way to aggregate it and then sharing it. So what one of the discussion points that we've been having, at least with our colleagues at the Ministry of ICT and Innovation, and as well as the Center for AI Policy and Innovation that PS Eve mentioned, is to think about data transfer mechanisms across different organizations. So starting with putting in the policies in place and the mechanism, but also closely following up in terms of how do we stock take what's there and what the potential that is within our data, and how we open that, at least parts of that up, so that people can be able to leverage it for their businesses and so on. So it's a work in progress, but it's something that's under development.
Thank you, Tessie. Jess, we have a couple more questions for you. One of the questions is, what does it require for all the technologies, the drone-based monitoring in Akagera Park, to be extended to other protected areas? Is there a framework? Is there specific coordination that's required?
I think it goes back to what question do we want answered? Do you have business plans? What can technology address? If you can't even get rangers in the field, you wouldn't look at drone technology unless it's just not possible to have rangers in the field because it's a swamp. So drone technology also at this stage is quite expensive for protected area management. It has to address certain capacities of flying longer than the 30 minutes like a general purpose drone, you know, imagery, things like that. It has to answer questions that the management have. And that could be through imagery, through detecting heat sensing, through fires, potentially addressing poaching issues. So every protected area is different, has different budgets, different requirements. So it's very, very hard. We are not there yet. We feel potentially drone operations, if they do come to Akagera one day, would be in 5-6 years' time when you get the Gen 2, Gen 3 drones that allow us budget-wise to operate. So it's really different. Every conservation area is different and has different budgets.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you all very much for your insightful conversations, and I want to thank people for asking the questions as well. We will be moving on to our next topic and our next panel, but thank you all so much for being here. All right. Last week, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity published the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, a gloomy report on the progress made against the 2020 Aichi biodiversity targets. The key message highlights that the world collectively failed to meet the targets set in 2011. None of those 20 targets, ranging from biodiversity values, habitat loss, sustainable marine, fishery, agriculture, pollution reduction, climate change, and financing biodiversity, to name a few, were fully achieved. One alarming fact is that humans are exploiting nature and destroying on an unprecedented scale. The world is at a crossroads, hence this panel session. The conversation will focus on some of the pressing issues that relate to Africa, specifically to Rwanda. Against this background, this next panel will discuss and share their reflections on this important subject. I would now like to introduce Dr. Carmen Nibigira, who will moderate this conversation.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Joanne. It gives me great pleasure to actually introduce my panel, and I'm delighted to have seasoned experts in the field. I will start with Juliette Kabera, who is the Director General of the Rwanda Environment Management Authority, REMA, to which she was appointed in May 2020. Prior to her appointment, she held the position of the Director General of Environment and Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment. Juliette began her career as an environment management officer at the time when Rwanda was developing much of its forward-looking environmental institutions and policies. She was also involved in drafting the enforcement of different laws, such as the 2008 law banning plastics in Rwanda and the 2019 law banning single-use plastics, the environmental law 2018, among others. Juliette currently serves as the chair of the executive committee of the Multilateral Fund, the Montreal Protocol. She's also pursuing her MBA in conservation from the African Leadership University Schools of Wildlife Conservation. That gives me actually great pleasure to introduce the next panelist, who is actually Dr. Sue, the Director of Research at the African Leadership University School of Wildlife Conservation, the same school where Juliette Kabera goes to. Previously, she worked for wilderness safaris as a private sector ecotourism operator for 10 years in various roles, including a group sustainability manager. She's the vice chair of the IUCN WCPA Tourism and the Protected Areas Specialist Group and coordinator of the Communities Heritage Working Group as well. She recently managed the Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program for IUCN in 24 countries in Africa. And her research focus is on sustainable, diversified wildlife economies in Africa. And then the next person, another link to the same school, is Mr. Charles Karangwa, works since 2016 as a regional technical coordinator of forest, landscapes, and livelihood program at IUCN Eastern and Southern Africa. He also leads Sustainable Finance Initiative, the same organization within the region, with more than 17 years experience in landscape management, conservation enterprises development, and conservation and climate change. So those are some of the things he has been dealing with for the last 17 years. He holds a master's in poverty reduction policy, and then also he had completed his master's at the same schools of business at LAU. So ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to actually start this conversation by tackling one of the issues we are facing, and then we are discussing the Global Biodiversity Outlook report, which came out last week. So to dive into this conversation, I'll invite Dr. Sue to look at this question from a finance and business case when it comes to diversity, biodiversity, sustainable, and then measures in place on the at the continental level. So Sue, please come and share us your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Carmen, and thank you very much to RDB for the invitation to be on this exciting panel and this really exciting event. I think, yeah, in terms of understanding value and the integration of biodiversity into government's planning and processes, first of all, Fred mentioned that we're doing this research, and which is across the 54 countries in Africa. And one thing we've really just found is a lack of data on understanding the value. And I think an old business adage of you can't manage what you don't measure really not only holds in the business sector, but as much in conservation. And so I think Jess and Kathleen also alluded to it as well, is, really understanding the value and what we need, what we're getting from it, and then how do we integrate that into investment. So any asset that you have, you need to know its value to know how much to invest in it. And I think currently in Africa, in almost every country that we've looked at, there's very little understanding at a national level of wildlife and biodiversity and the value of that. And I think in terms of what there is, obviously Kathleen mentioned it, the national capital accounting is one way of doing it. But just a lot of the biodiversity value is often at an informal level. So what we do need as well is enabling conditions and legislation and policy to try and also manage the informal economy a little bit more, to try and understand that. I did some research in Zambia around the Mosotunya National Park and try to get an understanding of how much the communities were using from the forest reserve and the national park and the parks or the reserve around there, and then trying to get them to understand the value of that themselves. So I asked them, how much, if you had to buy what you're collecting from the forest, how much would it cost you? And they were all like, no, but it's free. And I'm like, yeah, no, it's free when you go and collect it. But if you had to buy it, how much would it cost you? And I think raising that awareness within communities, within governments, of actually that it's not free, that there is this value to it, will help with the financing of it, because then we can understand that this is a huge asset. I mean, just the research we're doing for this report, I've been working in conservation for 20 years, and I've just been astounded at how much African economies rely on natural resources in every way. So not just tourism, through hunting, through non-timber forest products, through carbon, through ranching. And those are just sort of the main ones we're looking at. There's also film, real estate, so many aspects of it. So really, as I said, to manage it, we need to measure it. And then it came up in one of the previous panels as well, this breaking down of silos between sectors. So currently in most countries, you have the environment department not meeting with land planning or with water. So really forming some kind of like biodiversity economy task force within countries where they're meeting regularly to understand the impacts that biodiversity is having on all those sectors and vice versa. And so some kind of environmental profit and loss could be legislated that, private sector companies and all government divisions really measure that at a local level as well as at a national level. So you really are taking into account biodiversity impacts in every stage of development, in every stage of planning, and really, yeah, accounting for it in a way as an asset, as you would in any business. If you owned a shop and you were buying stock and investing in stock, we need to look at biodiversity in that way as well. So that mindset shift that's come up, I think a lot of the words, you know, coming up in the panels, you know, all the same, the diversify, breaking down silos, and yeah, the benefit sharing is critical as well. I mean, we all, I think everyone that's on this call, you know, is so aware that if communities aren't seeing tangible benefits as well as intangible benefits from biodiversity, we're not going to have their investment in it and their support of that. And Rwanda is really great at that. Kathleen mentioned the 10% revenue share. And I think across the board, I saw there was a question in the Q&A about, you know, a lot of the benefits go to communities around the parks specifically. How do we broaden those benefits? And I think that's a question asked in a lot of countries of Africa. And I think, you know, having these funds that are managed so that the funds go beyond just around the protected areas, every person in the country benefits. And I think Rwanda does a great job. This event itself raises such great awareness. And I think that really is what we need to focus on, raising awareness of the value and the benefits.
Thank you so much, Sue. You are so right. I think we need to build a business case and then make sure the government and the public and private sector actually collaborate. I think this is something which keeps coming from all the panelists who have spoken before. Actually, I'm glad that we have Juliet on this panel. Juliet, the unsustainable use of exploitation of resources is often one of the main threats to biodiversity, and this has been indicated in the report. But how to strike the right balance, given the environmental challenges we face, demographic pressures, food security, and development goals for a country like Rwanda. Would you like to tell us what are the gaps in Rwanda policy action when it comes to promoting and ensuring the protection of environment, sustainable management resources is in place? So in a nutshell, really your question is to bring down the conversation to the case of Rwanda, what is being done at the policy level, and what is the government of Rwanda doing to actually bring the gap and then the legal and the policy framework, which has to be coherent in one way or another. I think your microphone is mute, Juliet. Would you like to unmute it?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Anne. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation at this very important virtual discussion on biodiversity, really. Thanks to Dr. Sue for those were great remarks, insightful, and really the global biodiversity outlook and biodiversity conservation in Rwanda, we really see the same picture at the Rwanda case. And probably I also want to thank you, Carmen, for setting the scene and for the great introduction. So there is no doubt that around the world, like the outlook just showed it, there is, we are in a crisis, really, and that human activity is to blame. I think that's what the report was talking about, more or less, for the rapid, wide-scale loss of the biodiversity in the natural world. I want to first reflect on the value of wildlife and the world's places in Rwanda. So we don't actually think that these are free resources. They are there, they are naturally available, but the idea of calling it free actually is where it all goes wrong to begin with. I think Dr. Sue did mention about that. We should know the actual value of these natural resources. So approximately 70% of Rwanda's freshwater comes from Nyungwe National Park, and the forests together with others across the country help to purify the air that we breathe. You cannot attach a figure to that, but it's definitely it's priceless as it is. They promote rainfall through release of moisture, suck and store carbon dioxide, enable ecotourism, and provide habitat to resources. The value of the parks to Rwanda has been estimated at a $4 billion per annum. And this is really a staggering amount when you compare it to the annual GDP. It's around $9.5 billion. So the total value of a Kagera wetland complex includes the the stock, we have a lot of carbon storage there, a lot of billions on the annual flow, totaling up to around $12 million. So does Rugezi wetlands. We are seeing these trying to approximate it to a given figure, so we get a notion of, we run away from the fact of thinking that this is free, but again, I want to underscore that this is just an estimation of what this could be estimated to in value, in figure, in money terms, so we know how to manage this. So why we know these figures to some extent is because Rwanda managed to join the Wealth Accounting and the Valuation Ecosystem Services project, which was led by the World Bank, with a goal of to try and incorporate the natural capital into development planning, national economic accounting system. So the natural capital accounts have been developed for land, for water, for mining, and they are now being integrated into the planning process of the country. So I'm trying to at least see how, from a bigger level, how the government is trying to try and attach a figure to these natural resources. So when when we develop the policies are trying to actually be put into place tangible policy actions on how to manage these resources, because now we have kind of a value that we're putting across to make a business case, or to make a case for government to invest into management of these resources. So I think we don't really need to look at this as a balance. We don't need to balance economic development and environmental protection. In fact, we just need development that supports environmental protection and biodiversity, and a healthy environment that enables development. The only trade-off probably that we need or we face should be between polluting industries, which need to be got rid of, and these gradually we are getting there because of the different policies that we are trying to develop. But importantly, those are already some that are already in place, and we are already implementing them. So to come to your question, Carmen, in Rwanda we have a strong legal and policy framework in place already to guide this sustainable development agenda. We have the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy, and our recently launched action plan known as the NDC, the National Determined Contribution, which provide us with a clear set of goals that we need to achieve in a horizon up to 2050. Under the Climate Action Plan, Rwanda aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 38% compared to the business as usual by 2030, and has committed to spending up to $5.4 billion on adaptation over the next 10 years with support from different partners that we work with. So in this strategy, we see government already committing to do the actions that will help to reduce the carbon emissions, because we know this is all a nexus. If we have a lot of emissions, then inevitably we are affecting the biodiversity. So we have to decide to focus on a number of key adaptation intervention areas, including water, agriculture, land, and forestry, plus human settlements, health, mining, the list goes on. These include initiatives such as disaster risk monitoring, integrated early warning systems, and disaster resource plans. So because we know that climate change will leave no sector of the economy untouched, we are working across government and with private sector, civil society, and development partners to implement the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy. This strategy has a number of program actions, from efficient transport systems to disaster and disease prevention. Basically, the strategy is guiding Rwanda to become a developed, climate resilient nation by 2050. So our task now is to understand and take advantage of the opportunities that lie in the green growth and sustainable development and nature-based solutions. These are not simply buzzwords that come in and go, but there are ways of doing business and actually create more jobs. Enliven our environment, protect human health, and foster biodiversity. So in a nutshell, we have the policies, they are all cutting across, and I think in all these policies we need to see biodiversity part and parcel. We cannot have try to develop probably sustainable urbanization without seeing biodiversity embedded and part and parcel of that development of that sector. So we need to have every sector's development that is inclusive of biodiversity management. And this, at least on a policy perspective, on a legal framework perspective, I want to really congratulate my government that has done already so much, but now the real issue is to have this implemented, have this become a daily way of thinking, a daily way of planning. How do we plan together as sectors during the planning process? I think this is something that we are trying to improve day by day, but the good news is we are seeing progress. All in all, this requires all of us to play our part, from civil servants to civil society, to the private sector, to the academia.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Juliet.
so
I think, thank you so much. I think this leads to actually my question to Charles, and definitely Juliet has highlighted the importance and the impetus of collaboration between the government of Rwanda and other private sector or other entities or non-governmental organizations. So Charles, gaps were identified definitely in the reports, and the next decade requires a diversity of partnership, public, private, and civil societies to really address the pressing issues and the need toward the targets. Limited capacity, definitely, both financial and human, as Dr. Su mentioned, are some of the major obstacles to the implementation of the convention. Please, can you take us through how the resource mobilization is done and what that looks like for a country like Rwanda?
Thank you, Carmen, for the $1 million question. When you bring issues of financing and resource mobilization, it becomes another side of the coin from what Juliet mentioned of policies and strategies. Having a very good policies and good strategies in place, that's not necessarily translated into actually implemented and successes, because you still need resources to get this done. And I wanted also to, of course, thank RDB for inviting me to this very great session. I think to start this, I want to build on what other previous panelists and speakers just mentioned. Africa is changing as a continent. Africa is changing in terms of population because in the next decade, we are talking about nearly 2 billion people on the continent, and this will increase to 2.4 billion. I think you've mentioned this already. And Rwanda alone, of course, we are talking about the middle range scenario, 16.7 million by 2032. And this alone should tell us much about what change needs to happen now or never in terms of how we plan ahead, how we look at the next transitions for our development patterns. The demand and competition between development and conservation will continue to happen unless there's a paradigm shift in planning, in strategies, and in financing. To address conservation needs, I want to allude to the Outlook report. From more sustainable forestry practices to protection of elephants and rhino and our beautiful mountain gorillas, there is an estimate of nearly 400 billion that must be invested globally each year, at least. And from this, only 50 billion now is available. And this leaves us with a gap of nearly more than 300 billion US dollars. That's a gap. and it represents, of course, 80% of gap in necessary funding. This is quite a huge, and in Rwanda alone, I think Juliet mentioned some numbers, some figures, but I was just looking at the biodiversity finance report. We are talking about at least having $10 million every year to implement our national biodiversity strategy action plan. So this takes in the next 10 years, we need basically close to 100 million euro in financing, at least to continue conserve this biodiversity. And this will take more than traditional donors, more than just domestic resources, to require a shift in the funding, a shift in resource mobilization, in terms of really bringing in new potential sources of capital. And I'll try to use some financing terms here, and efficient supporting systems to scale up, of course, the great innovations that we already discussed. The great strategies can be implemented in terms of really conserving the Mother Earth. But more importantly, because we don't have a second choice than just protecting the only Mother Earth we have. This is the only one. We don't have a second one up to now. Of course, there are a lot of research going into Mars and others. But today we are talking about the Mother Earth, our only mother we all share. And today, of course, we see the trend. The largest conservation finance for biodiversity, for environment, for restoration that our colleagues from IRIS mentioned, from different things comes from government funding. So basically public sector finance. And this means a lot because most of reports today mentions that, and this is the same for Rwanda actually, more than 80% of our the total funding that goes into conservation of protected areas comes from government. So it's a public finance. And it means a lot in terms of how we start thinking about resource mobilization to bridge the gap in this biodiversity outlook report. And I wanted also to mention a number of other things. I think the next 10 years will define, of course, what the world and what Rwanda will look like, simply because we are in a decade of action where the global climate change ambitions are going to be implemented, but also we are in the post-2020 biodiversity aspect. So basically we needed to really reimagine our investments in development sectors. We need to reimagine how we finance development for future generation, of course. And this means a lot in terms of really how we bridge the gap. And I'm thinking about building on what Juliet mentioned, resource mobilization trends will have to really change. And I like the word that we started with of diversification. Diversifying financing instruments will be very, very important, but more importantly, greening development sectors. Let me give you a number of examples just for sub-Saharan.
Charles, we may not have the time to discuss this very broad topic. I think the time allocated to us is very much limited. I'm just going to give 1 minute to actually ask a simple question to Sue and yourself and Juliet. As your parting shots from Sue, how do we move on to actually, I would say, incorporate biodiversity into national accounting? Just parting shots.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, I mean, I think there does need to be a total mindset change. The words come up already, but you know, often we look at conservation as like preservation, like this shrinking. We need to have these protected areas that are getting smaller all the time, and they're threatened by everything. And we need to change our minds and think of it as an asset that we invest in and grow it. And you know, take it all the value that we get in from that, social, cultural, economic, and account for that into the finances through environmental profit and loss, natural capital accounting. And for me, a big thing is the old African proverb of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So let's all go together and collaborate and work together, all the different sectors. So we measuring it at every level.
Thank you. Juliet, 2020, the population around 13 million Rwandans. And then if we look at 2050, the double population of Rwanda, we are looking at 20-something population. And we know Rwanda, the population density is quite high. How are we going to tackle this from a policy standpoint? Just parting shots.
Thank you, Carmen. From the policy perspective, it's going to be mainstreaming. In everything that we do, we have to mainstream the biodiversity, environment, because we know if we are doing infrastructure development and we have a portion of biodiversity, protection and promotion in that area, then we are going to get there. I think the key word is mainstreaming.
Mainstreaming, if we need to work far, we need to go together. Charles, your parting shots on the partnership, how it's going to look like, because it has to be different. It has to be radical. It has to be different from what we have done before, because this is a total lost decade. So we lost one decade. How do we move on the next decade?
I think the key word from really resource mobilization and financing for the gap that exists today is greening. Greening existing public flows and of course directing all the financing stranded flows, and as well as, of course, greening financial systems that we have at the moment, so that we can have impact to development sectors, which mostly is the major source of biodiversity loss.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Sue, Charles, Juliet, thank you so much. To everyone who was watching from wherever you are in the world, the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature is still attainable, but it requires a large-scale transformative and radical changes to the way we humans interact with nature. And I'm glad that we had seasoned experts to kind of like highlight some of the challenges we are facing and how we are going to get there. We need to make the most of the second chance we have. This is the next decade to do so. This is the decade of action. And as next time may be too late, the decisions and the level of action we take now will have profound consequences for good ill, for species, including us as human beings. I'm literally quoting what the Convention on Biodiversity, the Diversity Executive Secretary said, Elizabeth Mrema. And then to end this conversation on high notes, not everything is actually gloomy and doomy. There is hope. I hope there's hope. Collectively, we are called to play our role. So Juliet, Dr. Sue, Charles, thank you so much. Joanne, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. What an exciting panel. I want to remind everybody that this entire session, including the videos, will be available on YouTube. So we'll be able to relive that exciting conversation once again. Thank you so much, Dr. Carmen, for that. Before we go on to our next panel, I wanted to invite Belize Kariza again, the CTO of RDB. We have a couple of questions that we wouldn't get a chance to answer all of them, and they will be available on Twitter, so you'll be able to follow that conversation and have some of your questions answered. But I wanted to ask Belize if she's available. One quick question. Somebody's asking about the conservation benefits. So the conservation benefits, development projects, revenue sharing are more profitable to communities adjacent to national parks. Would these benefits be extended to populations who are not directly connected to protected areas, as this can help to change their perceptions towards conservation of wildlife outside the protected areas?
So thank you for the question, Joan. I think to answer the question, I think it's a very relevant question at this particular time. The first thing is to know is that government of Rwanda is trying to pass, through RDB, is trying to pass a wildlife law, and that wildlife law will provide an extension of these community benefits beyond national parks. So you'll be able to have business and conservation such as conservancies, sanctuaries, wildlife private funds, and such as. And the other aspect that we're working on right now is that government of Rwanda kept sensitization of the private businesses to ensure that they always consider a component of the community benefit beyond what they do currently, which is direct employment, such as like direct employment. So I think that's what I could say about the question. We were happy to elaborate, and maybe provide some information on the wildlife law directly to the person who asked the question. There's some really, really good articles in the law that will be able to cater for community benefits, for communities to actually benefit beyond the national parks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, for taking the time to answer that. And as I mentioned, you could follow the Twitter account for more questions and for more on this conversation on conservation conference. Thank you. I want to move on now to our final panel, Zoonotics, the global pandemic and gorilla health. We know that the pandemic was caused by human behavior, the way humans interact with wildlife and nature in general, and how we manage biodiversity. It has been wildlife diseases to humans related to the ways we manage and interact with wildlife and nature is intimately connected to our effectiveness in biodiversity conservation and achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to invite Professor Beth A. Kaplan, Acting Director of the Center of Excellence for Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at the University of Rwanda, who will lead this panel.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to have this discussion. And I think we have a really exciting panel here. I'm grateful for them taking the time to talk to us, this fourth panel. And I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I had given them some guiding questions. So then we'll get started with a discussion. We're going to focus on the intersection of zoonotic diseases, biodiversity conservation, and the maintenance of human and wildlife health. And we have quite the breadth of speakers for this panel. Our first speaker is Dr. Julius Nziza. Dr. Julius is a wildlife veterinarian with a degree in veterinary medicine from Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda, and he also has a master's in public health from the University of Rwanda. He is Rwanda's country head veterinarian at Gorilla Doctors and the country coordinator for the Emerging Pandemic Threats Program, also called the PREDICT Project. His main work is in overseeing mountain gorilla health and doing research on zoonotic viral infectious disease pathogens in wildlife that are potentially the pandemics at the human-wildlife interface. He's been working with Gorilla Doctors since 2010, and prior to this, he worked with the Rwanda Development Board, RDB, as a field veterinarian at Nyungwe National Park, and he's very interested in bridging wildlife conservation and public health. Our second speaker is Dr. Olivier Nsengimana. He's the Executive Director of Rwanda Wildlife Conservation Association. He's a founder and executive director, and he is also a doctor of veterinary medicine. He has a Master of Veterinary Science, Conservation Medicine from the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And in 2014, Olivier designed a conservation project to address the illegal trade in the endangered gray crowned cranes in Rwanda. He won a Rolex Award for this work, and that helped fund the establishment of this Rwanda Wildlife Conservation Association in 2015 that began work with gray crowned crane conservation and has expanded to many other species endangered and threatened in Rwanda and in the East African region. And he's been a finalist for a 2016 Tusk Conservation Award. He's received a 2017 National Geographic Buffett Award for leadership in conservation in Africa, and the 2018 Whitley Award. And most recently in 2019, he received the Future for Nature Award for his work in conservation in Rwanda. And our third speaker is Dr. Seban Nsazimana. He's the Director General at the Rwanda Biomedical Center here in Kigali, and he holds a medical degree and a master's degree in clinical epidemiology from the National University of Rwanda, and a PhD in epidemiology from the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute at the University of Basel, Switzerland. And he serves as a fellow at the African Scientific Institute, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians at Edinburgh, and he serves as assistant professor of global health at the University of Global Health Equity, and he also teaches epidemiology and research methodology at University of Rwanda. And he's now, as I mentioned, Director General of the Rwanda Biomedical Center, and he's been working in the health sector for over 14 years. So we have three speakers that have experience and a breadth of knowledge in health, in both wildlife and public health. And I'd like to start with Dr. Julius. I would like to have you tell us what you think we need to look out for with regards to gorilla conservation and great ape conservation and health in general, given this pandemic.
I'm happy to be on this panel and in this conversation on conservation. Thanks for the question too. So great apes, in fact, as many of you might be aware, they are closely genetically related to the human being. So meaning what this means, any health effects affecting the people, especially people that could be accessing these mountain gorillas or any other great apes, they have a potential, they can potentially share the viruses or any other diseases to this population. So what you're supposed to be looking out for, and this is very, very crucial, is to see how to mitigate any cross disease transmission from people to these great apes. And of course, their immunity is way naive. If it is a new virus or a novel virus and it goes through this population, the consequences, the health consequences are very, very drastic. So we should be, this pandemic is like a very, very huge wake-up call. In addition to the other effects that that would affect these populations, this pandemic has really again opened our eyes and brought the essence of making sure that we have these mitigation factors that should be actions, strategies that should be implemented so that these viruses don't jump from people to this population. And that's very, very, very important to consider. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about what you think are some of the strategies that could be adopted both in Rwanda and the region with mountain gorillas specifically, and perhaps with great apes more generally, because, you know, as you mentioned, there the similarities and also the high potential for spillover because of the tourism and also the proximity with humans and great apes.
Yes, thank you again. So tourism is very, very important for mountain gorillas and also other great apes conservation, because these revenues are very, very important. Not only do they bring troops on the ground or people to protect the animals, to pay the professionals, but also the local communities also get initiatives that help them promote the conservation of the great apes and mountain gorillas in particular. And Rwanda is a very good example in that. So, but the strategies, especially that should be focused on, mainly, I would begin with the concept of multidisciplinary collaboration. This is very, very crucial, where the people ask the veterinary doctors concerned with the health of the animals, the epidemiologists, the medical teams, the other stakeholders, so that we be sharing information of what we have found on the ground, so that we could properly collaboratively implement the strategies for disease prevention and control. Take an example, if we have a situation like in the local community, for example, of a respiratory infection that is going around in the communities, it can easily potentially go to like in the conservation area through either the local people or even PACA personnel going inside with this infection. So the major aspect is disease information sharing, long-term, short, long-term plan, so that we could have these platforms to share these issues in a collaborative manner. At the same time, the disease prevention strategies, for example, what we have learned from this COVID is, for example, issues of mask, following the great ape tourism rule regulations that should be like almost the Bible of what we should be doing to make sure that we don't have any spillover from this population to this population, sorry. So it's really, really crucial that the multidisciplinary approach, what some people are calling even the One Health approach, in addition to disease prevention and the control, it will also help so very, very, very much in case like an outbreak happens, so that we can have a collaborated contingency plan for any future disease outbreak or pandemic. So again, this collaboration is very, very crucial, from professionals to the local communities, to the local governments, sharing information, sharing resources, and even capitalizing on the capacity already built in different platforms of detecting disease and the viruses too. So all of these are the actions that should be out there. There are resources even out there that we can benchmark on, so that again, we work as teams in conserving the great apes, and particularly the endangered mountain gorillas.
Good, thank you. I really appreciate this discussion of the multidisciplinary approach, and I think that's one of the benefits of bringing a forum like this, where we have people from many different areas coming together. So I'd like to turn to Dr. Olivier, and you've got the experience with mountain gorillas, but also now you're working with many different wildlife species and conservation efforts. So we'd like to hear from you about what you think are some of the important things we should be aware of as we move forward, as we move through the current pandemic and hope to avoid this next pandemic, and how we interact with biodiversity.
Thank you so much, Beth Kaplan. Thank you, Julius, for really discussing the possible way of transmitting disease from humans to grey apes and what other wildlife species. So I'd like to make 2 points here. I want to really tell the public, why are we seeing more and more zoonotic disease outbreaks, and what can we do to prevent the next pandemic? So to help me, I would like to explain actually 2 words that we are using. Zoonotic disease. There are those diseases that are caused by pathogens like a virus, bacteria, that originate from animals. The very good example that everyone knows is like rabies. The other word I would like to explain is spillover. So we are using spillover a lot, but spillover is an event when like a pathogen jump from one species to infect a new host species. So new zoonotic diseases are happening because spillovers are happening. And why are they happening? So the main reason behind this, like we are interacting, we are getting in close contact with wildlife in a way that has never been before. This is through like habitat destruction for crop production, hunting, wildlife hunting, for meat consumption, for illegal wildlife trafficking, and all of those events, they are really bringing us in close contact at a scale that has never been before. So you are giving a chance to new viruses to find new hosts and causing disease. So when you look like in the past 20 years, we've recorded so many zoonotic outbreaks. And when you look the scenario, it's always the same scenario where like we've damaged biodiversity, we've created something, we changed our behavior, and we've created a problem. So let's face it, we are creating global pandemics by damaging our biodiversity, by creating or disturbing the landscape where we are living. So my advice to this is like we need to give space to nature. And most of the time we always feel like really we want to create national parks, we have national parks, but we want to go beyond, we need to go beyond national parks. We create space for nature in the cities, in the suburbs, in the agricultural area, so that we can cohabitate with wildlife in a way that we are not interacting so much. In that way, we can minimize the risk of disease. You know, we humans like to think we are really skilled, like when we create problems, then we find solutions. For example, we are looking for vaccines for this COVID-19, but by the time we have actually the vaccine, it might be too late. We might have so many damages. So my point is, like, I don't see the solution into vaccine, although it's really nice. So it's time that we all work together collectively to think of what we can do to contribute into nature, to invest into nature. Every single business, every single individual has been affected in one way economically So let's not be taken by economies like our own personal life. Let's like practice conservation. Conservation should not be like a choice. It should not be for some people. It should be for everyone. We cannot achieve economic sustainability or social sustainability without environmental sustainability. I think that's my point that I would like to make here.
Thank you, Olivier. I feel like we could really dig into this a lot more too in terms of particular strategies. I know that there's a lot of activities going on right now, a lot of initiatives in Rwanda, but I really appreciate what you said about this issue that we need to give space to nature, and that's really resonating with in the previous one of the previous panels, this discussion of the global outlook that was just released, and really this call that we need to change the way we've been doing business and the way we interact with nature. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, and also this important point of working outside of protected areas. And I know, Julius, you've also been involved in work in that area of the importance of not just protected areas, but also outside protected areas where a lot of the interaction between humans and wildlife happens. And so that's a good segue into Dr. Sebin, and we'd love to hear from you about your thoughts on this current pandemic and how we can avoid future pandemics, coming from the perspective of human health or public health, the sector that you work in. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Beth. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, wherever you are. So it's a pleasure to be here on this panel. First, when I was invited to come and join you, I was thinking, why am I going to talk about, I don't know what I'm going to say as a medical doctor, and this conversation on conservation. I've been practicing this conservation conversation, but I hope I made it. But then after I reflected, oh, maybe there's something we can discuss. When I went back in the history of medicine quickly, I thought about the pandemics that changed the lives of humanity. If I pick the main 6 major pandemics, you always see that they originated from animals, and then they cross to humans, and they continue to kill people. From smallpox to plague to HIV, Ebola, and now to COVID-19. All these are diseases that in our medical terms and vets we call One Health, where humans, animals, and environment are actually, when they're not dissociable, they're always connected. And whatever happens to one of the 3 triangle elements, we cross to the other. So that's why I'm here, and I'm pleased to discuss this in the next few minutes. But again, if you look at our DNA and how we are very close to animals, particularly gorillas and other primates, you'd see how it's important to have this conversation. And if you look at the evidence we have in hand in medicine, there's few data, there's few evidence that actually humans can transmit COVID-19, as an example, to animals. It has been actually confirmed in cats and dogs and few other animals, and we could find more. And it's not ruled out that actually animals could not transmit back to humans, although the probability until now is low, but it's possible. But if you look at where this pandemic you're talking about came from, you always see that bats are most probable sources or reservoir of this disease. And this environment, animals and humans triangle connection is important to note. So one thing our father of medicine mentioned that I want to share with you, he said, and he's Hippocrates, he said, optimal public health depend on a clean environment and conservation. So if you look at the life we live, the people we meet, the animals we have in our household, or in different places where we visit, the environment, the places we visit all the time, you will see that it's actually, it has been a delay. We could have been involved in this discussion earlier before as doctors, as vets, because we are working together. Now, COVID-19 and tourism. This is the current pandemic. I believe that the world will never be the same again soon with this situation, because this virus is affecting everyone, everywhere, tourism, economy, medicine, all of us. But going to be future pandemics? The answer is yes. Where is going to come from? We know that it's going to come from either from animals or from humans or from the environment. The answer is clear. How do we prepare for that? We need more research. We need more evidence. We need surveillance. We need to work together to detect it, prevent it before it reaches 30 million like it is now, or killing 1 million people like almost as COVID did. So we need to work together. The health sector is very pleased that now we see that whatever affects humans affects everyone, affects the lives we are living in. And actually, we could have this conversation so often. And the best way to prepare for next or future pandemics, as I said, is to work together, but also to have strong health systems, because this is going to be a priority for our humanity in the future. Maybe I can pause here, unless there's a few follow-up questions. Thanks so much.
So I see a common theme here is about the need to work together, and I'm just finding it really exciting to have this level of interdisciplinarity in the group we have here talking. And I think it's not often really, maybe it is with you veterinarians, but that conservation biologists actually sit down and talk with medical doctors. So this is really great. We have a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is a question about mainstreaming biodiversity. Mainstreaming biodiversity in sectors with a huge footprint on biodiversity is a tool that can contribute tremendously to curb biodiversity loss. And the question is, how can this tool be effectively implemented? So maybe I could start with Julius to see if you could take a shot at answering that question.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Beth. And thanks for the comments from my colleagues, Dr. Sabine and Dr. Olivier. So I think biodiversity conservation mainstreaming is very, very, very important. And in fact, if around me a little bit is we are now even looking going beyond human, animal, and whatever, but looking at ecosystem health. What is biodiversity health? What are the indicators? What should we looking at in making sure that the environment actually where these animals are is very, very well. In addition to protection, it is healthy. So I think mainstream is very, very important. This is something that should go beyond even us professionals, but also the local communities, schools, school kids, children, those in lower and higher learning institutions. So it's very, very, very crucial. And I wanted to make one point here that health, to defend public health, the environmental health and biodiversity health and the conservation are very, very interlinked. So that's why it's very, very crucial that whatever we are doing, let's not leave out the concept of biodiversity health. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Dr. Saban said about optimal public health depends on clean environment and conservation. And that's a really good and basic reminder of why and how we need to work together. I want to ask two other quick questions. I'm told that we're getting close to the time limit here. One is for Dr. Saban, and could you talk a little bit about the relationship with biodiversity and medicine, especially the role of traditional medicine or indigenous knowledge? And then another quick question for Olivier is about what government can do more to enhance this approach, mainstreaming and working together. So let's turn first to Dr. Saban, just maybe a minute or so, and then to Olivier.
Great. Thank you very much. I think from traditional medicine to the modern medicine, wherever you call it, humans have been always very closely connected to environment. And what we've seen as the source of diseases like viruses, bacteria, they're not coming from nowhere. It's the lives we live in. It's not just we're getting it from animals or from environment. We humans also transmit these diseases to environment and also to animals. So the importance that we've been seeing is we are not paying much attention to this connection until a pandemic like this happens. So if you look at where this virus originated, we were watching it last year, and it started from a market. It is spread across the world, and it is now affecting everything we are doing. Could we have been better to stop it? The answer is yes. But we knew that many of these viruses are coming from specific reservoir animals. And if we see how many viruses we cross, diseases we cross every day in our daily lives, there are more than 200. Every year, there are more than 4 new viruses that are actually coming or transforming from old viruses. So the evidence is actually available, but the investment to detect it and to prevent, to me, is what is missing and what has been missed. I hope that with this pandemic, we've taken a lesson as humanity that we need to protect us by protecting environment, by protecting animals, and also, as I said, from medicine, we know from many years back that if we have better environment, better diversity of whatever we live in as humans, we're better. We can even prevent disease without taking medicine. And this is a fact. This is very known.
Thank you. And briefly, Olivier?
Thank you so much, Beth. I think Dr. Sabe has already mentioned some of it, of what I want to say. But I think there is one issue I would like to tackle that government need to focus on. It's illegal wildlife trafficking. Illegal wildlife trafficking can be one of the root for emerging infectious disease. All of this pandemic can come from this practice. So government needs to work together more than ever to really tackle this issue. From inside the countries, like from low level to high level, and then between the countries to really, because one disease can travel from one area to another one, and yeah. So one other thing I would like to focus on is surveillance. We like by doing actual surveillance, like a multidisciplinary surveillance, to be ahead of what would happen, to know what is in nature, what is in wildlife, so that we can prepare before to minimize the risk. We've seen like what is taken for COVID to get to a vaccine. So when we know what's there, the virus, their characteristics, the ecologic characteristics, we are better prepared, even like coming up with things like a vaccine and the medicine way before we face the damages that we are facing in the current pandemic. So, and we need to share information. Like we can't say like, oh, this is what's happening in our country and we have it all by ourselves. The world is connected. One disease can travel from one end of the world to the other one in one day. Countries, governments need to share what's there and how we can better work together to find solutions. So that's what I think at the government level and world level we can do.
All right, I have another question here, and since our yeah, I guess we need to close. I'm getting a message that we need to close. I think there's so many interesting questions here. I really want to thank all of you so much. I really think we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but this does give me hope, and partly because I noticed that there's so much happening with technology right now, with artificial intelligence and other forms of monitoring and surveillance. And I saw that a couple of themes that came up were issues of needing to work together, multidisciplinarity, so working across disciplines, and also the need for surveillance and early detection. So I think we have the capacity for that and the will, and what we need to do is get into action. So thank you all so much for your attention, and thanks to the audience for these great questions, and I'm going to turn it back over to Joan.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan. And thank you to the panel as well. As always, very interesting conversations. We're all learning new things, at least I am today. We have come to the end of our program, and I want to thank you all so much for being a part of it. I am now pleased to welcome our next speaker to provide the closing remarks for today's event. I'd like to invite the Deputy CEO of the Rwanda Development Board, Zephanie Niyonkuru, to give our closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. Thanks a lot to the speakers. We've learned a lot today, from conservation aspects to relationship across the animals, human being. When Dr. Sabe was speaking, I was enjoying that particular lecturing, same with the rest of our speakers. And I just wanted to thank everyone who took part in these interesting discussions as we discuss these important aspects that are related to conservation. It has really been pretty much fantastic to hear from a wide range of distinguished experts today, and I want to thank you all for your contribution to these conservation efforts. I also wish to thank many partners and participants who have joined us from around the world, and for your questions, insights, inputs, and contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, Rwanda has put nature conservation at the center of economic development, because if you look into the numbers, this industry is at more than 80% nature-based. And in Rwanda, we have 4 national parks: Akagera, Gishwati-Mukura, Nyungwe, and volcanoes. And they make key access of the Rwanda tourism destination management areas. These parks alone make 8.9% of the national territory dedicated to nature conservation. Tourism plays a major role in the country's economic development. Currently, it's been contributing around 10% in our GDP. And tourism provides more than 80% of total farm employments. It's really seen as central to the realization of the vision that we have as a country, Vision 2050, where we want to become a higher income country. And really, tourism is one of the major forces that we've been using in terms of eradicating poverty and also making sure that Rwandans keep enjoying better lives. In fact, it's fundamental for transformation and modernization of the economy. And it's really the country's top foreign exchange earner. We get a lot of foreign exchange from tourism. Prior to the pandemic, if you look into the numbers from last year, 2019, we received around 1.6 million visitors. And out of those, we had 111,000 visiting national parks. And if you look into the revenues these visitors contributed or paid, you're talking around almost 30 million in terms of revenues to the national parks. And if you look at the sector in general, we generated around $498 million from this particular sector, from the tourism sector. But of course, this was a special year. Everyone has been talking about it. And I think we've been reminded that the stability of nature is no longer guaranteed. Anytime anything can happen. I think Dr. Sabe was alluding to this, saying, do wait for another pandemic, or is it going to happen? His answer was yes. So we have to be super prepared. But for too long, we have definitely considered Mother Nature an infinite well of bounty from which we can simply take what we need and want. Today, that approach is not sustainable because we're having a lot of changes going on: climate change, pandemics, species extinction. The warning signs are clear and troubling. We know, however, that when we come together, share ideas and experiences, embrace a bold vision, and commit to action, we can definitely make a difference. The success of mountain gorilla conservation is just one example. The population of these mountain gorillas increased from 604 in 2016 and the Virunga Massif compared to 480 in 2010. This was really a significant increase, which was driven by mainly conservation efforts that were put in place. And of course, this led to an improved status of the mountain gorillas, ranked by the International Union for Conservation of Nature in 2018, from critically endangered to endangered. Achievements of this kind, however, require that we change the way we think about nature. We must move from the mindset of value. We must move to this mindset where we value and keep investing in the nature. Simply put, investing in nature is more of the best investment that we can make as human beings. It makes all of us healthier. It improves agriculture yields. It protects the biodiversity. It creates jobs, and it addresses issues and aspects related to climate change and much more. As you may have heard during this event today, the Rwanda Development Board is advancing a legacy program for Rwanda and the world, in which conservation and tourism benefits would catalyze for community development and economic transformation over 5 years. If you look at what has been happening, for example, some of the key components that we have, if I may probably talk about 4, we want, for example, to expand the Volcanoes National Park by approximately 37.4 square kilometers, and also securing the national park boundary through the design, location, and construction, and also doing even fencing. We have also been working on several interventions which have been really improving the livelihood of people around the parks. We have more than 17,000 Rwandans who have benefited from the activities around the park. And we have also been investing in improving sustainable and conservation-based tourism experience and economic benefits for Rwanda and the Rwandans. And also other interventions have focused on creating land use buffer zone, totaling to around 6,620 hectares within 500 to 1,000 meters adjacent to the national park to serve as transformation areas, to protect national park conservation values, and improve the socio-economic growth, well-being of Rwandans. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of shift in thinking can only be fostered through creative collaboration. That is just one reason why Rwanda values our partners so highly, from Diana Fossey Gorilla Fund International to International Gorilla Conservation Program, Africa Wildlife Foundation, Gorilla Doctors, to African Leadership University, African Park Networks, plus the private sector that have been investing in hotels, in conservation, to operating activities, among others. To conclude, I encourage everyone to ensure that the conservation we've had today don't stay virtual, but rather lead to the new collaborations, foster exciting projects, and bring about a greater sense of understanding and agency about the path we must take to ensure nature and conservation sit at the heart of everything we do. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today. It has been my pleasure to host today's conference. Thank you all so much for your informative contributions for your expertise and passion for your subjects. And I want to thank all the participants joining us live today for these incredibly important conversations. Please find more information on the Twitter accounts of Kwita Izina, Visit Rwanda, and RDB, and additional videos on the Visit Rwanda YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you all so much.